Yes, people, welcome back to GNA TV and Chelsea Fan TV. I hope you guys are well. Has been a while since I've been able to do a show. Sorry, I have been slightly under the weather, as I was talking to Ben on just off air as well. But I am back, and we are here to go through some transfer news. We are getting to the sort of nearer end of the transfer window. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with especially Chelsea Football Club, which is what we're going to be talking about today, guys. But make sure that you're smashing the like button, subscribe to both Chelsea Fan TV and GNA TV, and let's cue the intro. Yes, people, welcome back to GNA TV and Chelsea Fan TV. I hope you guys are well wherever it is that you may be around the world. And I am here again with Mr. Ben Jacobs. How are you, mate?
Very well. We're winding down. We're inside the final 2 weeks of the window. And as a result, we're going to see a merry-go-round of movement. So really exciting for fans because we've obviously spoken regularly during the window and things can turn into long-winded sagas, but there's no time left now. So everything has to be fast and definitive. And I think that fans, therefore, can be quite excited by the last 2 weeks, especially from a Chelsea perspective, because they're going to be busy.
Exactly. And it seems like Chelsea specifically could be doing a lot more business at the latter end. There's been talks about them maybe getting 2 or 3 more players. Some people may feel only 1. You know, it's up for opinion as well. But yeah, we're going to get into it. And I wanted to start with outgoings first. And Trevor Chalobah looks like a player that could potentially be on his way out of Chelsea on a loan move. Obviously, Chelsea apparently not interested in the sort of obligation to buy or the permanent move of Trevor Chalobah. Just wanted to get your thoughts and feelings on it, really, and if you've got any updates on Trevor Chalobah yourself.
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's very clear that Chelsea are open to letting him leave on loan, and that tells you to some extent, by implication, that Thomas Tuchel is confident of landing another senior centre-back in his squad, and the likely destination, mostly for game time and partially at the request of the player, is in Serie A. That's where the lion's share of the interest is at the moment. But as with, say, Callum Hudson-Odoi, what you find is that when one club realises, and Pulisic may be the same, that there is an opportunity for loan, then you suddenly get a huge array of clubs circling. So I think that this is a very likely loan move. I'd be surprised if Chelsea give any option to buy, because I think that they want to keep the player. And obviously he enjoyed a breakthrough season last year. I remember when he scored on his debut, but now kind of on the periphery of the squad, and definitely so if any more centre-backs come in. And with Koulibaly being automatic in the starting 11 and Cucurella able to play as a centre-back as well, it definitely pushes him down the pecking order. So a loan move away feels like something that is very sensible all round. As I said before, there'll be no permanent option in the deal. So this is just a move that makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of possible destinations, my understanding is that there's a large array of interest coming from Serie A in particular. And the Inter possibility could be quite interesting if, for example, even though it's not what fans want to hear, if Chelsea don't get Wesley Fofana, Milan Skriniar's on the market, PSG have revisited that deal, but they don't want to pay the 70 million euros. And Chelsea looked at Skriniar as a possibility in a Lukaku trade deal earlier in the window, when there was a suggestion at Chelsea's end that it might be a permanent deal and they may take a player the other way. Inter were not open to that. They want straight cash for Skriniar if they're forced to sell. So maybe there's a possibility of talking to Inter separately about Skriniar if Fofana doesn't come off. They're one of the clubs looking at the player, and then Roma and even Milan potentially as well. Now, Milan's an interesting one because they wanted Sven Botman in January and this summer on a permanent deal, but they couldn't find the financials. And obviously he went to Newcastle as a consequence, but was very much holding out because Milan were making it clear that that was the type of player that they were looking to bring in. So they are pushing to see whether a loan is a possibility. And when you negotiate a straight loan, it's quite challenging because whereas, say, with Brighton, they just want the reinforcement, they were prepared, therefore, to not be too bullish, even though in an ideal world they'd have liked to sign Levi Colwill on a permanent deal. But from Milan's perspective, and it's more in the Serie A mentality, they don't love the idea of bringing over a player and then finding that he just returns and they've got no chance to kind of capitalize off the year maybe that player gave them. And it's not just over in Serie A, it's very commonplace as well in Ligue 1 too. So you look, for example, at Marseille and William Saliba at Arsenal, and they were really frustrated because, again, they brought the player, he had a breakthrough season, he showed his class, off he goes back to Arsenal, and they've got no real ability to use that loan to be front of the queue to buy the player. And that's where sometimes you get interest and it fades into nothing, because unless it's a loan with that option, one or two of these Serie A clubs will not be interested. And I think that will be in particular Jose Mourinho's perspective, despite the links with Roma. But Milan and Inter are definitely interested. And there's more and more clubs circling now. Chelsea have put the message out there that they are open to a loan deal.
Interesting stuff. At the beginning, when I first heard this news, I wasn't too happy with it as a Chelsea fan in person. I mean, I wanted him to stay. I felt like he could be used as rotation, but then I thought about it and I thought, well, if we get Fofana, obviously, I think the important part is obviously Azpilicueta signing a 2-year extension, which, you know, if he doesn't, then you probably think Chalobah stays. And the fact that he's here, maybe Tuchel favours him a bit more. Some people feel that Tuchel don't favour Chalobah as much at the moment. Maybe the loan move is the better option, providing that we bring in the Fofana, who we're going to talk about next, Wesley Fofana. But, you know, it's an interesting one because I think there's a talent in Chalobah, you know, because Thiago Silva's not going to be around for long. Koulibaly's on the latter end of his age as well. So it would be very, very silly for Chelsea just to allow a player like Chalobah just to leave on a permanent basis, or, you know, even have a buyback option for the club that's obviously taken him on loan as well. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where he goes to. Some people feel that Lukaku might have a hand in him going to Serie A as well, but I don't believe too much into that. But yeah, we move on from Chalobah. Someone that we spoke about last time round, I feel like we're still stuck in the same position. I'm hoping there is some more better news on it, is Wesley Fofana, because obviously Chelsea are interested in the player. Leicester still holding out for a value. Obviously, Chelsea have agreed personal terms with Fofana. Where do we stand with this, Ben? Obviously, you're a Leicester fan yourself. I mean, how close is a deal going to be struck between Chelsea and Wesley Fofana for you?
We're not there yet. That's the bad news from Chelsea's point of view. And Leicester maintain this public stance of not for sale or unwilling to sell. And Brendan Rodgers kind of has oscillated between different wordings on that. So it's all about convincing the Leicester board. Brendan Rodgers is kind of stuck in the middle. The same with trying to bring in incomings as well. He knows what he wants in an ideal world, but by the same token, Leicester have a need to bring in some income. And ideally, number one, they would like to take a fee from Youri Tielemans between now and when the window shuts, and that kind of alleviates everything and perhaps then takes them through until January when they can reassess. But Leicester haven't got any big money coming in, and they have a need to generate income from a club-wide perspective and in the short term as well, if they're to move in the market. So all of that points towards Chelsea having confidence that they can test this so-called not-for-sale stance. And then the other thing is that after you've made 2 bids, as Newcastle found with James Maddison, who Leicester are hoping to tie down to a new deal, if you then get to intermediaries and direct talks, you start to believe as a buying club that there is a genuine possibility. Otherwise, after those 2 bids, which were roundly dismissed, you tend to just walk away. So the intermediaries are used to get a real sense of, is this not for sale stance genuine or not? And then by the time you go for a so-called 3rd bid, you like to do the due diligence, the back and forth, and the meaningful contact. And that's exactly what has happened over the last week or so. And therefore, there has been progress. And I think that fans sometimes look at bids like Football Manager games, and once 2 is made, they say, well, where's the number? Why have we not come back in with a 3rd bid? And that's just not how the negotiation works. And it's also not what either the buyer or the seller want to put out there in the market. And the reason for that is because if you bid instantly and go up in high incrementals each time in the space of 42, 50, 70 hours or whatever. And the reason why I don't say 24, 48, 72 is because there's often a back and forth that overlaps between days. It's not like you place a bid, you wait 24 hours, you go to bed, you get up. There's often a morning meeting, a number, a verbal back and forth, and then finally another verbal offer or number, either informally or formally. So it's much more fluid than people realize. So if you're Chelsea, you certainly don't want to put out there that you bid, rejection, bid again. And each time you go up by 5 million, 10 million, because that sends the wrong message to the market when you're then trying for Aubameyang or De Jong. Barcelona will just say, great, Chelsea say they don't want to pay 30 million euros, but all window, they're the club that changed their mind in 24 hours and go up and up and up. And then from Leicester's point of view, they don't want to put any bids out there because anything beyond 2, especially if it's actual back and forth rather than just dismissed from a more formal offer, that paints the picture that the club is open to a sale. And that's exactly what Chelsea want, but it's not what Leicester want to put out there. And if they do that, who's to say that other suitors won't come, and then Leicester may get a bidding war, and they don't want a bidding war. And that's the reluctance behind this whole thing, that everyone says Leicester will sell for 85 million. They'll sell out of a necessity for 85 million, but not because they actually want to. They would love to just turn it down, have the window shut and move on. But there may be a number, and there probably is a number, that Leicester simply cannot refuse. And the determination currently taking place is, what is that number? So the back and forth is very sensible and much more quiet and secretive, and verbal offers, informal offers, numbers will be kind of touted. And there's a grey area now as to what is an offer and what isn't an offer. And if it's rejected, it may well be denied by both the buyer and the seller. So officially, the situation is that Chelsea haven't tabled their third bid, but they may well have floated numbers and, as importantly, structures that get them closer to a point where when they finally place the bid, they have a confidence that it will be accepted, because there's no time left in the window to kind of mess around. And the difference at the moment is that Chelsea are not talking 85 million, and they're also not privately resigned to the fact that that's what they'll pay. If we get to the last day of the window and they desperately still want Fofana, they may have to try their luck, and that might be Leicester's tactic now to just drag this on. But Chelsea really want to pay more, like 72 million. That is my understanding. So it's some way off the 85 million that is currently being suggested. Now, within that 72, there may be add-ons that take it more like 75 to 77. But a few days back, there was also more preferential structures being discussed that had better payments in terms of less installments and more gettable add-ons that had a base fee of more like 66 to 68 million plus the add-ons on top. And then the other structure is more like 72 million with kind of potentially 5 to 7 million of less gettable add-ons. So under both kind of scenarios being discussed, first through intermediaries, the total amount is way below 85 million. And then Leicester's end is, well, it's 85 million. We want the best possible structure, and then we'll let our board decide. And that's kind of where we're at the moment. So we wait for Chelsea seemingly to table a third bid, but they may not actually present yet anyway a formal offer that technically is the third offer until there is more of a middle ground in any verbal conversations to see whether anything is possible. And the longer the window goes on, the more bullish Leicester are going to be. And that's a tactic because, as I said before, Leicester would like to get towards the end of the window. And if they deep down know that they're going to have to be forced to sell, they're hoping that as time ticks away, Chelsea will just be forced to cave into their financial demands. And obviously Chelsea's tactic is the complete opposite, that they are trying to create a situation where Leicester are looking around aside from Fofana saying, yikes, who are we going to replace him with? And if they find that replacement and it has a big transfer fee or even a modest transfer fee on it, then do they need to just take the money and run because they need to leave time to get their other deal? And is that other deal contingent upon the money that Chelsea will give them for Fofana? And this is the whole politics of the situation. And fans want black and white, but no deal like this is ever black and white. So it might seem boring. It might seem like there's a contrast in the news that you read from the Chelsea perspective or the Leicester perspective. And everyone wants wants a clear answer. And the only clear answer at the moment is that Fofana desperately wants the move. I don't think at this point he will hand in a transfer request, because it doesn't do that much good, because Leicester know that he wants the move. So it's all going to come down to the number. There's a lot of politics between buyer and seller in how they are approaching the negotiation, tactically speaking. And anyone that just wants is he going to join? Yes or no, is not looking at the window through the reality of how it works. And of course, somebody that tells you it's definitely yes, or it's definitely no, or they're definitely going to pay 85 million. So why haven't they just bid 85 million? That's just trying to come down on an extreme side, jumping the gun before the reality of a very complex negotiation that is tactical. So at the end of the day, the longer this runs on between now and the end of the window, the more likely it is that Chelsea are going to have to pay a massive amount of money or walk away. But there is a long way before we get to that point. And to reiterate, Chelsea's stance is still that they want the player at way under 85 million. And it remains to be seen at this point whether Leicester are forced to accept that, or whether Chelsea are going to have to go up a little bit in their valuation.
Yeah, I've always been one to say that I feel that the Fofana deal is quite an interesting one in terms of the value of the player. I do think he's overpriced, in my opinion. I did ask you, that's funny because you just answered it as well. I did ask you, why doesn't the player put in a transfer request? I know Leicester know that he wants to leave, but I thought, well, if the pressure is put on by the player for them to start looking for replacements, to then maybe have to agree an actual fee that they maybe don't want to agree, a bit less than the 80 to 85 mil, say in the 70s region, so that he does go, and Chelsea are willing to pay the 72 million. If Chelsea are waiting on Fofana to do that, let's just say that they don't want to spend that and Leicester don't want to accept what Chelsea have offered, then the only way forward, I felt, was that Fofana lay the transfer request down for the pressure just to be sort of turned up a bit against them, So then you think that maybe both clubs would have to negotiate, and then Leicester would have to move on and get somewhere pretty quicker. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's a fair hypothesis. But what you've got to bear in mind is that Leicester have the leverage here because Fofana signed a new deal in March. So if Fofana turns around and hands in a transfer request, then Leicester can go back to the player and say, well, if that was your perspective and you were hopeful of getting a bigger move, with all due respect to Leicester, why sign the contract in the first place? And within that contract, there's a sort of gentleman's agreement, not in writing, but there's a guarantee from Leicester that if a fair or reasonable offer comes in, then it will be considered and or accepted by Leicester, but in the summer of 2023. So Fofana has actually been given quite a lot of liberties by Leicester. He's been told that he can sign, get a better deal, and go in a year's time. And you can't really ask for a better position from your employer. And at that point, even Chelsea would not have anticipated that Fofana would be available this window, but they've tried their luck, and he still might not be available this window. But Chelsea obviously are still there. They're pushing, and they're going to try very hard right until the end to persuade Leicester that it's worth selling Wesley Fofana now. And what's interesting, by the way, in the context of all of this, is just the old regime of Chelsea. And it's a very underreported angle. But my understanding is that the old regime told Todd Boehly that Wesley Fofana was not an attainable target this window to begin with. And had Boehly been given different information, or had the old regime prior to Boehly, even though there were sanctions and the club had a whole question mark over it, but if they had gone to Fofana when the contract had not been signed, they may have got a clearer determination. And who knows, then Fofana might not have signed the contract, because he could have said, well, Chelsea's a very viable possibility early in the window. And I think this is a classic example, because it's not a criticism of Marina. It's a classic example of how Abramovich's exit and the uncertainty over the sale slowed everything down. Because how can Marina go around without knowing who's going to own the football club and line anything up definitively, to the point where Fofana wouldn't have just waited speculatively, because who knows at that point, because we're talking about March, who the new ownership group would be. But I think that it's very, very key, because if Chelsea had stability, if Bowley, just in a hypothetical, was in January or any point before Fofana signed the new contract, because he was on Chelsea's radar under the old regime, because he was on Manchester United, by the way, their radar as well. Chelsea's interest isn't new in Fofana. It's not last minute in Fofana. The scramble is because there's suddenly a very real sense at the Chelsea end that Wesley Fofana is available this window and thus in the next 2 weeks. But if it was that viewpoint prior to when he signed the new contract, Chelsea would have definitely, under the old regime, had they had the stability and not the sanctions, exerted pressure on Fofana not to sign a new deal and said, if you want this move, and it's clear how quickly he decided that he does want to join Chelsea, don't sign the new contract. And then Chelsea would have had all of the cards and Fofana would already be a Chelsea player. So this is a byproduct why we're in this scramble for Fofana of, unfortunately, the intel from the old regime coupled with the uncertainty over the football club at exactly the point when Fofana chose to sign a new deal at Leicester.
Interesting. We'll have to see what happens. I've been just reading the chat as you were talking as well. A lot of people saying, well, maybe we should wait till next season, keep Chalobah and go again next season with a longer way to negotiate. Would Leicester come down more at that point? I don't know. Like you said, he already signed a contract. He'd lose a year on it. Would it make much difference? I don't know. He could have ultimately a better season with Leicester and be valued at that rate, or maybe a bit more. Who knows? You know what I mean? So it's going to be interesting to see what Chelsea do moving forward with the Fofana deal. But I've got a feeling that we're going to get an answer to it hopefully sooner rather than later. Anyway, getting questions. I was going to go straight onto the midfield and talk about Casadei and De Jong, which we're going to talk to in a minute. I keep getting asked about this Brazilian guy, Endrick Palmeiras. I don't know if you heard anything of that, but apparently 60 million euros bid. I've not heard anything of that, have you? For this young boy?
Just a player that has a phenomenal record, and I've seen reports that Chelsea are chasing him. 16-year-old Brazilian wonder kid. I would be surprised if the valuation is as high as has been reported. The player is one of those where you have almost every single major European club tracking him. Bayern have looked at him. Barca and Real have looked at him as well. Atleti even approached his entourage at the beginning of the window. So there's a lot of competition here, which would obviously raise the price somewhat significantly. So I am aware that Bowley likes this type of player and, again, has been on Chelsea's radar prior to Bowley's arrival. So there's going to be a lot of competition here. And Chelsea are definitely in the mix. He's 100% on their radar in the long term. Whether that translates to any offer being made now or mad push. But the thing about Bowley is that we know he works fast, and Barcelona cannot find that money or sign the player right now. So it would only really be Real Madrid out of Real and Barcelona if Chelsea are to move now. I'm not aware of any kind of formal bid. And the other thing is that because of the age, they would effectively be buying and, under the rules, loaning back out anyway. So this would not be anything that, because of the fact he's only 16, would have an immediate Chelsea impact other than ownership of the player. But it would be such a big coup, because this is just the name that you hear in terms of next major talent, Brazilian wonder kid, and every single club under the sun is chasing him. So as I say, I'm not personally aware of a formal bid and not at that number or value, but it is absolutely true that Chelsea, including under the old regime, have been tracking him for quite some time. And it wouldn't remotely surprise me if Bowley chooses to move now, because tactically Barcelona can't. Real could, though. So one to watch for sure, because the player himself at youth level has got an insane scoring record.
A very insane scoring record. I actually watched some of his highlights of some of his goals as well. And I'll tell you something, there is a talent in that boy. And I do think wherever he does go across Europe, he will definitely, we'll see. It's a different challenge to where he's playing at the moment. But I think he's definitely got a raw talent about him. So definitely one to watch out on as well. You brought out a tweet earlier on today about Cesare Casadei. is how you pronounce it, even though my Italian's awful. From Inter on a 6-year deal. Obviously, we've agreed around sort of 20 million euros, which I think you said was about 15 million euros plus 5 million add-ons for that player. What's your thoughts on this sign? Just a quick one on this one. I mean, what's your thoughts on the sign of the player? Do you think he's a player that Tuchel and Bowley have bought? I mean, some of the Chelsea fans feel that it might have been quite a bit of money for a player that is well in the unknown from our perspective, not understanding. But I mean, how do you think he fits in with Chelsea? Do you think they will use him this season, or do you think they'll just like loan him out again? What do you think will happen with that sort of player?
I think you'll see him because he's going to oscillate between the first team squad and the academy. So naturally, when Chelsea get a game, perhaps with less at stake or squad rotation in a World Cup year, he may well be part of the squad once or twice. But you do also have to contextualize that against the fact that he never made a senior appearance for Inter. So there'll be no chance of him being thrown straight in. Very much one for the future. But if Chelsea had a League Cup game, who's to say that he won't suddenly appear part of the squad? And this, again, is the advantage, by the way, of the 5 substitutions too, that if he was to be part of any squad for the experience or because there's less at stake, you then have that option to give more players a little bit of game time if you get in a scenario where you have a perfect situation. You're 3-0 up in a game with nothing at stake, and it's perhaps a smaller game to allow him to be in the squad to begin with, and suddenly you find that the minutes are there. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if we did see a cameo or two, but it's not the priority. This is a signing that has been brought for the future. And Chukwuemeka at 18, Hutchinson at 18, Gaga Slonina, who's gone back on loan for now to Chicago Fire to finish the MLS season, and Casadei. The other players I've mentioned are all 18. He's 19. This is Todd Bowley not only signing for the future and being prepared to put money behind the conviction, but in addition to that, each of these players have been tied to long-term contracts, which is a very American thing to do. So then all of the leverage is there at Chelsea's end as they develop, and the fees may seem big, but if it doesn't work out, there's still a feeling as they develop that you get your money back or better. And if they do work out, then the original investment pays off, because not only do you get a player with a much higher market value, but they're tied down to long-term deals. So as they then start to hit their peak in 3, 4, 5 years' time, they are actually on very economically strong deals. And that's the sort of thing that a young player ultimately agrees to. Sign now on really good terms for your age and your development. But then if you become box office at 20, 21, 22, from Chelsea's point of view, the wage bill is extremely balanced. And because they're on the up, as they get better and better and better, there's more incentives for them to develop and be rewarded financially. And then perhaps after 3 or 4 years, that's when you then start talking about a new deal. And then the ones that maybe don't work out, and there always will be names that don't work out, they still have pathways because Chelsea have them for the long run. So not only will there be a bit more patience around their development and opportunities to loan them out and maybe commercialize off that, take a loan fee, but if after that 3 years, 4 years, it really isn't working at Chelsea, there's still that ability, as I said before, to sell them off and break even. So it's a good model. It's a slightly different model because Chelsea have been perhaps notorious for just buying either finished products or overbuying young players and then finding there's no place for them. And the final thing I would say on this is just, it's not only about the young players that Bowley is buying, it's also about the strategy. So when Chelsea have bought young before, it's often been on the whim of the moment and the manager and the system. And then when a manager changes, certain younger players that are on the peripheries or still being developed become a spare part. And I think now this is all about Bowley saying, listen, I want a strategy and a style and an approach to both recruitment and development and pathways, regardless of what system we play, regardless of what manager we have, regardless of what happens at senior first team level when these youngsters arrive. And that's really important because, again, it's about a pathway. And he's effectively saying, if I'm going to pay 15 million, 20 million on an 18-year-old, on a 19-year-old. I want to know they're given a fair shot. I want to know that there's a plan for them through loans or through development. And then I want to know that when they finally hit that age and standard, that if there's a different manager, a different system, a different approach, there's still a place for them at that football club. Otherwise, effectively, he is wasting his money and falling into the same errors of years gone by. So Abramovich did a lot right at the football club, of course, because he won 21 major trophies. But maybe that disconnect between ownership group and academy level for men and women's teams was the one area for improvement. And now I think because Bowley's so hands-on, and this is why as an owner and as an interim sporting director, it's going to be so beneficial that he's been in this role in the short term because he's seen it firsthand. And there's no owner I can think of that's ever been in this position before. So when he goes back up to chairman and minority owner, this window is going to be invaluable because it's forcing him to think about the football club at levels that he wouldn't normally be directly doing so. And then when a sporting director comes in and he becomes more of a strategic business brand figure at the football club, I think this time working in the nitty-gritty of football at all levels is going to be so important to the continuity and the structure at Chelsea Football Club. And that's why what he's doing, I think, is so novel and ultimately will benefit Chelsea in the long run. So not players to be judged now entirely, but maybe flashes of them will be seen. But very exciting from the perspective of Chelsea, I think, to know that Bowley wants to throw this volume of ambition and financials at players that are still in their teens.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how we move forward. And like, you know, we under the Roman era, we never would have moved like this, you know, going for the young prospects across. And I think they are looking for the long run, the future of Chelsea Football Club. And I like that. Go and find some of the top talents across Europe, get your scouting department to actually do their job to a degree and work hard and do their bit. And ultimately, it's good to see that we're actually trying to move in that direction. So we'll see how we fare with that moving forward. I want to jump onto De Jong real quickly before we get onto Aubameyang. I see a lot of people talking about Aubameyang. There's been a little bit of news that's come out about him as well, which we'll catch up on in a second. But in terms of Frankie De Jong, again, I still feel we're in sort of the same position as we spoke last time. He needs to make the decision whether to take that pay cut and whether or not he's going to do that or not. I mean, any more news in regards to De Jong up to this point?
Well, decision's already been communicated by De Jong that there'll be no negotiations surrounding a reduction, and it was also very strongly stated by his agent over a week ago that he is not saying even that he's open to the pay cut, but no discussion over that. Even less of a pay cut will be had if he stays before Barcelona pay him his deferred wages. And that was the decision made very clearly on the side of De Jong over a week ago. He still wants to stay, but that's nothing new. He's been consistent in that position for the entire window. So it's all about Barcelona paying him the deferred wages and then hoping that as part of that compensation that he's owed leads to a pay cut. Otherwise, they are potentially going to have to force him out of the football club. And that's when the door is open to a suitor like Chelsea. So in that respect, nothing's changed, but it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that nothing's changed, because De Jong said consistently throughout the entire window that he doesn't want to take the pay cut and that he would like to stay at Barcelona. And what gave Chelsea the optimism was simply the fact that the feeling from Chelsea is that Barcelona cannot allow him to stay under these circumstances. So once again, as I've reported pretty consistently throughout the window, Chelsea's hope is in Barcelona helping them force De Jong out of the football club, at which point a move still becomes viable. And make no mistake, Chelsea are still there, but they've said all along they don't want to be messed around. So if De Jong says, okay, I will leave, then Chelsea will revisit between now and the end of the window. And if De Jong ends up staying at Barcelona, then Chelsea will always argue that they did their best to agree a fee, and it never went any further than that because they didn't want to be messed around by either Barcelona or the player. The other thing to point out, which I think now is common knowledge, but again, I've said many times over about the last month, that the De Jong forced out, in inverted commas, is contingent upon Barcelona wanting Bernardo Silva. And it now appears that Manchester City are going to hold out for at the lowest end 80 million euros and at the highest end 100 million euros. And unfortunately, from Barcelona's perspective, not only even with a De Jong fee can they find all of that money, because it's not like Manchester United or Chelsea or whoever ends up buying Frenkie de Jong are going to give you the full transfer fee up front, and some of it's in add-ons. So not only is it difficult for Barcelona to sign Bernardo Silva, but also Silva's not forcing a move. He likes Pep and Manchester City. It's absolutely true that he would take the move and would see it as a dream transfer. But if it doesn't come off, he's not going to do a Fofana and throw his toys out the pram internally or on social media. So that doesn't help either. And it's a key part of all of this, because if Bernardo Silva doesn't sign and Barca are able to offload Depay and who knows, Dest as well, then they may be able to make the financials work and keep De Jong and then continue any pay cut or deferred wages negotiations once the window shuts or into January. So this is why it's so complicated. There is a lot of moving parts. Chelsea have not exited the race, but there's very little they can do at the moment until effectively either Barcelona force De Jong out and then come back to Chelsea, or make any progress with Bernardo Silva, which I think is quite unlikely at this stage. And that is why it is so frustrating to deal with Barcelona, because everything is on their terms. But make no mistake, if De Jong leaves, the preference will still be Chelsea over Manchester United. And Manchester United have now effectively signed Casemiro, subject to medical. They have bid for Anthony and all kinds of other players. I don't see any situation now where Manchester United will get De Jong. And I got hammered for saying that, and have been hammered for reporting all window that the preference would be Chelsea over Manchester United. And everyone sends you a different source and different counterpoint. And I respect all opinions, but I will say one thing. Where has this alleged Manchester United offence last week and this week gone for Frenkie de Jong? Where has this intimation that de Jong told teammates he was joining Manchester United? Where's all that gone? Nobody at Manchester United. Yeah, but nobody at the Manchester United end has questioned the validity of that. And in fairness, it's because you get lots of competing sources. It's very possible that a genuine source in the Barca dressing room said that. It's very possible that Manchester United briefed optimism. They did, for sure. But if they were that optimistic, why have they not moved on it? And the answer is two things. One, because Frenkie de Jong still wants to stay at Barcelona. And two is because genuinely, if he was to leave, and it isn't if, so you have to take both points together. It's not his preference is Chelsea over Manchester United, so let's get excited about it. It's Frenkie de Jong wants to stay at Barcelona, the most important point of everything. And that has been the case all summer. If there becomes a scenario in the next 2 weeks where he's forced out the club, the door is still open to Chelsea. But again, Frenkie de Jong wants to stay at Barcelona, and that is why the situation hasn't seemingly, from the outside in, moved significantly since the last time we spoke.
Interesting stuff. I still feel he's going to stay, to be honest. And if that means him taking the pay cut, I think eventually he may do that to even stay, to be honest. I'll be surprised if he does come to Chelsea. Just a little bit of breaking. Obviously, it says here from as reported from Athletic, that Leicester City's manager Brendan Rodgers is set to leave Wesley Fofana out. There's also some other articles that have just come out after that, just saying that it's Wesley Fofana saying that he doesn't want to play tomorrow, which I'm not too sure if I believe. I don't think players can do that, can they, to be honest? But yeah, apparently Wesley Fofana is going to be left out of the game against Southampton over the weekend. We'll have to wait and see how true that is. That was reported by David Ornstein, and it was also reported by a fella, an LCFC journalist that works for Athletic. Rob.
Yeah, that would be Rob Tanner, a really good journalist. Obviously, what you find is that the Athletic have club-specific correspondence, and sometimes what you find is that the club brief a club-specific journalist differently. So you'll get your club Chelsea journalist and your club Leicester journalist potentially at the same outlet being told different things. And that's really good because it allows two journalists to work together to try and get the full picture. So the hint dropped by Rodgers in his press conference was that he would be prepared to omit Fofana if the headspace was not right. So that suggests that Fofana either is not in the right headspace to play, or, as you say, has specifically asked not to play. Now, because this is breaking at this point, I would have to go off and make some calls. So I don't want to come down on one side or the other. But Leicester are bound to bill it as they will leave Fofana out of the squad. And then we will find out at some point whether that is genuinely Leicester's choice or whether that is Wesley Fofana saying, I don't want to play. I think that because of what we spoke about before, if Fofana said to Rodgers, don't pick me, I don't want to play, that would be a weird side to take prior to first handing in a transfer request, because it feels like they're one and the same thing. So this could be Leicester saying to Fofana, you're staying, period. And therefore, we're not going to play you and we're going to give you time to process that. But that then becomes really interesting, because then Leicester's next Premier League game is away at Chelsea. So what are they going to do? Bring him back at Stamford Bridge and play him 5 days before the window shuts? I can guarantee you that if Wesley Fofana's headspace is not right to play for Leicester, and Leicester's decision is not to play Fofana against Southampton, then they will not play him against Chelsea unless they're making a statement, because his headspace is going to be even worse. So that kind of tells you that there's a two-way aspect to this. Leicester are going to bill this as just, we chose not to play him to let him get his head aligned to the fact that he's still a Leicester City player. And obviously from Chelsea's point of view, they'll be delighted by this, because they'll see it as a further sign that Wesley Fofana has now played his last game for Leicester City Football Club. So you can't help but see this as good news for Chelsea, whichever reading of the situation you give to it.
Interesting. Let's see how that transpires at a later stage. I want to talk about Aubameyang, because this is the one that seems to be heating up quite a lot. Obviously, Chelsea were meant to have had talks with Barcelona in the evenings of last night, supposedly, about a move for Aubameyang. Now being told via a Spanish source, so actually bring this up, that the offer that Chelsea have put forward is in and around 19 million euros plus 5 million in add-ons for the player. Ben, where do you stand with Aubameyang to Chelsea? Do you think this is one that is near enough there to be being done, or do you think we're still quite far away from getting this done?
No, Chelsea are very confident on this one. And there was a meeting, as I reported a few days ago, yesterday, with Aubameyang to talk about personal terms, and everything on the player side now is heading in the right direction. It's always been a case of Xavi wanting Aubameyang and Tuchel pushing for Aubameyang, and it's about the pitch. And Aubameyang is happy with the financials and the Chelsea side of things. So I think now Chelsea feel like it's all just down to agreeing a fee with Barcelona. And Barcelona say that they want 30 million euros. And as I've reported before, Chelsea have always valued Aubameyang a little bit lower. And now it's a case of finding common ground. And Barcelona won't be as bullish, as I understand it, as asking for the full 30 million. I know that reports in Spain say that 25 to 27 million euros might be enough. My understanding is always that Chelsea, I don't know what the maths are between what's been reported whilst we've been on air and what the English equivalent is, not the exact maths, but my understanding was always that Chelsea wanted to pay about 18 million. So if, as you say, it's 19 million euros plus 5 million, that's 24 million euros, which I'm guessing, not having Google Translate to do the conversion, is somewhere around that same number, 17, 18 million quid. And that was my understanding, that Chelsea wanted under 20 million quid if they possibly could. But there's always been a confidence on Chelsea's side as well in the last 48 hours that when they finally place a formal bid, that the number will be acceptable to Barcelona. So there may still be some negotiation or some extra add-ons. Barca may turn around and ask for another 5 million on add-ons that are a bit less likely. And Chelsea may be prepared to take that if Aubameyang scores 25 plus goals, or if Chelsea win the Champions League or something. And that, again, is why structure is as important as number, because you can easily get closer to that 30 million euros with an extra 5 million of add-ons that just isn't that likely. But then if it happens, Chelsea are happy to pay it because they've succeeded in a certain area. So I think that's why there's a confidence regardless of any back and forth. And I'll say again, don't just look at it as, 30 million, but we've only bid 24. Why are we doing this? Look at it as structure and the actual guaranteed fee, as I understand it, is acceptable to Barcelona. So therefore, it's just about hammering out a deal now. And this is why Chelsea are very confident. The roadblock was really Xavi because he really wants to keep Aubameyang. So there's still that aspect of, much like we saw with Jules Koundé, can Xavi just persuade Aubameyang to stay? But Barcelona open to the deal. Chelsea feel that the guaranteed part of their offer is very fair, and it's up from the original 11 million that they bid to begin with. And there is player openness and buy-in. So this is a deal that I think is looking likely between now and the close of the window.
Interesting. Let's see what happens. He's also saying that the player's salary may be doubled. There was talks in the region of around 160 million in wages for Aubameyang, which is what I saw from another source as well, which is interesting to see. As a Chelsea fan, talking personally about the Aubameyang deal, I feel that it's I think 30 million euros is still quite a lot for him. I would have said, in terms of sterling, anything in around the regions of about 15 million, maybe an 18 million push for him would have been where I would go. But at the same time, what do you get from the player? What does the player bring? Obviously, he scores goals. Some people will moan about his age, and it keeps coming up in the chat. He's 33 years old. Is that old for a striker? Not for all strikers, don't get me wrong. And I haven't watched enough of him at Barcelona to know how good he's been or how effective he's been since he's left Arsenal there as well. But if Thomas Tuchel wants him, and this is the preferred choice of him. Obviously, he once played with, managed him at Dortmund as well. And so you'd think, in regards to the system, that he would understand it, and they'd be able to adapt and work well with Tuchel on it. Maybe it's a short-term solution, and maybe it may work, and it will cover an area for us for the season or two, in many ways. Because if we want Nkunku, we want Leao, and these are players that supposedly Chelsea are interested in at a later stage, then do you wait for that, or do you try and not wait for that and cover the gap for now and try and close the gap to the top while you can? And I think that's why we're looking at players like Aubameyang. So it'll be interesting to see at a later stage. Go on.
Yeah, and again, the only other thing I'd say is that don't judge the fee on the age, judge the guaranteed fee on the age, because once again, no add-ons are ever paid unless certain KPIs are hit. So the player could be 100 years old and you could call the fee 50 million. And if 25 million of them are in add-ons that say they'll only be paid if the 100-year-old scores 100 goals in his first 100 games, then if you pay that money, then it means he scored 100 goals in 100 games, in which case, who cares about the age? So once again, it's not, why are we buying a mid-30s player for potentially 30 million euros? It's, is there value in the guaranteed fee based on the age? And then anything else on top of that will only ever be paid if the player contributes to the team or hits individual targets in a way that makes that signing fully worthwhile. So you can't ever really debate per se an add-on unless you're saying, I'll give you 100 million for one goal. Then you say that was a ridiculous add-on. But add-ons are usually beneficial to the buyer, and the seller only gets them if the buyer as a football club and the individual as a football player does well. So therefore, the cumulative fee for Aubameyang shouldn't be entirely ratioed as a negative to his age.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with what you're saying there as well. Gordon, interesting one. Another one that Chelsea fans are split or torn apart against. And again, it's down to the value of the player. Chelsea have supposedly put in 40 million for one, and then another 45 million, which then got rejected by Everton as well. Everton want close to 50 million for the player. Apparently, the player is so interested to play at Chelsea as well, wants to move as well. I mean, what do you feel about this one? Do you think this is a one that could get done, even if we get Aubameyang and whoever else along with it?
I think it's one where Chelsea are still there, which tells you that 45 million is something they are considering. And who knows, at the moment, the bids have been straight cash, but It might not be 45 million. It might be a way of them offloading some players that they feel are surplus to requirements and getting Gordon in the process, which makes a lot of sense versus paying 50 million in straight cash. And from Chelsea's point of view, they know the player's head has been turned and it is one for the long run. In the short term, I'm not so sure if I was Gordon, I would want the move. And that's, I think, the difference between like a player like Fofana at 21 that feels that he can walk into Chelsea, develop, become an elite level footballer, even with some older centre-backs currently there. Whereas with Gordon at Everton, he's playing and he should be capitalising on Dominic Calvert-Lewin's injury and the fact that Richarlison has gone to Spurs. If he walks into the Chelsea team, I don't see as much or even a lot of game time. So if you're Chelsea, you're pulling off a coup still for the future and far more integral than some of the other young players that we discussed earlier, but still not integral, still not starting, in my opinion. Whereas at Everton, he could end up playing 30 plus games in the Premier League this season. And that's the reason that if I was Gordon and I was being advised on what's right for now, I might actually be persuaded to stay at Everton. So Chelsea don't care about that in many respects, but I'm surprised that Gordon is so intent on jumping ship because he's in quite a good position at Everton right now, playing under Frank Lampard regularly. So this is one to watch between now and the end of the window. It remains to be seen whether Chelsea will go as high as 50 million or whether they will try and make it what Bowley's always wanted all window, finally to pull off a swap deal. But they've not walked away. And that tells you that they may be prepared to pay big for a player that they rate very highly. And that shows you, again, that dual ambition of buying for now, buying for kind of now, and buying for the future. And Gordon sort of falls in between the buying for now and buying for sort of now. What I like about him, by the way, especially if Pulisic goes out on loan and if Ziyech ends up going between now and the end of the window, is that his most favoured areas are wide right and central. And he can go on the left-hand side a little bit as well. And by the way, he can also drop a bit deeper into more of a right midfield role too. He's a progressive passer. He's got good movement off the ball too. So there is that versatility there. And I think that even though if you judged him now on paper, you'd say, well, how many games is he going to play? If Pulisic was to be loaned somewhere, if Ziyech ends up leaving as well, if, as you've already said, Aubameyang doesn't join, then in Gordon, you have actually got that player that can play centrally, that can play on the right-hand side, and in a game management sense can switch sides to the left as well. If you look at the percentage of where he's played, the left-hand side is not really a huge area that he relishes or filters over to, but it's not impossible that he can switch sides at times. So that is of appeal to Thomas Tuchel. But right now, you can't tell Gordon exactly how much game time he's going to get until the complexion of the window becomes clear. But if you suddenly find that Ziyech went and Pulisic went and Aubameyang didn't come, then that's when you're like, well, maybe he does actually play quite a bit for Chelsea as a squad player this season.
100%. I think that if Pulisic, specifically Ziyech, Callum Hudson-Odoi, Werner's gone, Lukaku's on loan as well. That's a lot of forwards gone. I can see why we're looking at the forward line. And Aubameyang, I think we have to get done if that's going to happen. Gordon's an interesting one for me, only again because of the price of it. But then at the same time, I agree with you with the versatility. And when you look at how Chelsea have approached or signed the personnel that they've signed up to this point, they're all sort of versatile and adaptable in their own way. Cucurella, Koulibaly, Sterling. These are players that are adaptable in the formations. And you saw it a little bit against Spurs in how he played in such a hybrid formation between a 4-2-2 and a 5-3-2, which we saw in between the games. So they are adapt, and that's what I think Tuchel wants. He wants players that can adapt in between games and switch positions. And I think Gordon, at a young age, Premier League proven. I think the problem with him is that he's not where he's still so young. He's not proven. So it's like, what do you get with this guy? He's a young raw talent and whatever, but is he going to kick on? Are we going to see an even better version of him? Is he going to be better under Tuchel at Chelsea? Is that all going to work? But obviously, you can only back what Tuchel wants. And that's the one thing that Chelsea fans have all said at the beginning of this season. We want our manager to get the players that he wants. And if there's certain players that maybe we don't like or don't think works, but he thinks they do, and then we sign them, then we've got to back him. And that's the one thing that I think Chelsea fans need to understand and accept moving forward as well. But in terms of Callum Hudson-Odoi, Ben, just quickly before we finish, obviously there's lots of interest in him. Not really been told specifically a club where, but any news on him from your side?
Nothing much, because the player's assessing options, and I think everyone assumes that it's going to move fast, because they perhaps earlier in the window thought maybe he'll be tied to a deal for Fofana, because Leicester have had a historical interest in the player. But there's really quite a lot of interest, but not a huge amount of movement. And that's why we haven't seen any progress so far. So the thing with Callum Hudson-Odoi is that there's a lot of debate around the club internally as to what the specifics of a loan deal might look like. And the feeling from Bowley is that Callum Hudson-Odoi will not be gotten rid of permanently. And he wants to try and convince Hudson-Odoi that the future is just at Chelsea. Then you have the player's side, and due to the volume of interest, if not offers, he is, through his agent, presented with, this club want you, but only if it's an option to buy. This club want you, and they might make a late move in the window to only take you on loan, and so on. And therefore, a lot is going to come down to Hudson-Odoi, because he may go back to Chelsea and say, okay, I accept that you don't want to get rid of me permanently, so now I will consider the options that are loan only. But he could also come back to Chelsea, regardless of Bowley's perspective, and say, you want to keep me permanently, but here I am travelling up to Everton and I'm not even part of the matchday squad. I want to cover my back, and I want to know that if I enjoy a loan somewhere, there is going to be an opportunity to buy. And there's one or two clubs that will only enter the race for Callum Hudson-Odoi if there is an option to buy. Dortmund, for example, are one of them, that they're only going to bid if there's an option to buy. And Chelsea at the moment don't necessarily want to grant that. And that's what's complicating things. Newcastle are a club that have looked at him. Roma are a club that have looked at him. Leeds are a club that have looked at him very loosely a bit earlier in the window. I think Leeds' interest has ended right now. So there's a number of options for him, some concrete, some just inquiries, nothing formal though at the moment. And part of that is, again, because Chelsea want a loan deal for him on their terms. They're fully open to a loan, but they do not want a permanent deal. And ideally, they would prefer not to have an option to buy. And as soon as you remove that option to buy, some of the clubs will walk away from that deal. So I think that this is going to move. And I do think he'll end up on loan somewhere before the window closes. But it's more complicated than just, well, why hasn't he gone anywhere? We were told there's lots of interest. It's clearly in Chelsea's interest to loan him out. It's clearly in Hudson-Odoi's interest to be loaned out. Again, it's more complicated than that, because what if the player says, I just don't want to be loaned out. I want the opportunity at my end to potentially complete a permanent deal if it goes well. And that is where the buy-in between Chelsea and Hudson-Odoi needs to be had. They've got to get on the same page. So before a decision is made, from Chelsea's point of view, they want Hudson-Odoi to be saying, brilliant, I believe in my long-term future at this club, and glad you don't want to get rid of me permanently. Now I will go out on loan somewhere. And I think that's the same with Broja as well, or was earlier in the window when there was talk of a West Ham move. And now it's sort of flipped, and it's less about the loan and more about, if Broja believes that Chelsea is the long-term future, he'll sit down and sign a new deal. And once he's sat down and signed a new deal, if Chelsea then choose to loan the player, there's 100% buy-in. Everyone's on the same page. Broja signs the new deal. Then if there's a loan, he's like, great, I signed the new deal because I believe in this football club. Now I am prepared to go out on loan. But as long as there's a disconnect between what the player feels the future is and what the club want, there's still internal discussions needed before any deal is going to happen.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Let's see what happens on that as well. Tuchel has announced that Kovacic, Kante, Pulisic and Broha are all injured before the weekend, which is not good for us, shall we say, in many ways, especially in the midfield area. But we move forward with that. Also, Lampard's apparently came out and mentioned that Gordon is not 100% staying, but he feels confident that he will still be an Everton player, that he finds him important. However, he's not going to rule out the fact that he feels that there is a potential that he could go. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next week or so on this one as well. Lots of football over the weekend, guys, as well, for us to get into and watch as well. Does Wesley Fofana actually start? Does he not? So keep an eye out on Ben's Twitter feeds for any updates on that as well. But Ben, before we finish up, do you let everyone else know where to find you, mate?
Yeah, of course. CBS Sports Golasso is the handle at CBS. Serie A has started, so we're pretty busy with that. Champions League draw, of course, on the 25th, and we'll be covering that. Chelsea involved. Love to know who you want to draw and don't. I think everyone wants that Chelsea-Barcelona game in many respects because of how intertwined they've been in the window. But any other clubs that people would like, I'd love to hear from you. And then if you want to follow my personal handle, it's at JacobsBen on Twitter.
It's been a pleasure having you as always, and especially through this sort of transfer window as well, as we're getting to the end of it. But I'm sure we'll be able to get maybe one, maybe two more in before the end of the window, and hopefully Chelsea would have signed some players at this time and we can start talking about the players themselves as well. But guys in the chat, make sure you're smashing the likes, subscribe to both Chelsea Fan TV and GNA TV as well. Match preview for Leeds. Hopefully I might be able to sort one out. If not, we'll be doing a match reaction to the game, which is on Sunday at 2:00 as well. But enjoy the rest of your day. Take care of yourselves. Have a good weekend. And we will be back very, very soon. Take care.